Okay, we'll get started. So thanks everyone for being here. Welcome to the second event of a series focusing on instructional coaching. We've got one more webinar next week, which is kind of thinking of it from the senior leader perspective. And then Steplab is holding an instructional coaching conference in London on 9th of July, where we'll be sharing details of that at some point next week. So today we're focusing on from the perspective of the teaching and learning lead or the lead coach. And we've got a fantastic panel. Claire Hill is the Director of Secondary Improvement at Turner Schools, and where she looks after the exceptional coaching program they run there. Jon Hutchinson is the Director of Training and Development at the Reach Foundation and, importantly, a visiting fellow at the Ambition Institute. Both Jon and Claire are really experienced coaches and teacher educators. Thank you so much. We're really grateful to have you on the call. I'm the founder of Steplab and a former PD lead for the Oasis Trust. So, plan for the first half of today is for me to ask Jon and Claire some of the tougher questions which people sent in via Twitter. I may also chip in and ask a few questions or volunteer a few answers myself. And then in the second half, we're going to try and open the conversation up, bring in a few people from the audience to ask questions. If you do want to ask a question, something pops in, and we really hope that you do, please fire us a message in the chat or the Q&A function. It would be even better if you'd be willing to come up on camera and chat to us. So if you are willing to ask a question and show your face and ask it in person, please let us know in the chat. We hope for a really informal vibe. Keen to have a kind of round the kitchen table type discussion, lots of interruptions, some fairly loose sharing from me. So two final things to note. So we're talking today about what it means to be a great coach and importantly, how we can train them. If there's questions on implementation and culture, please come along to next week and ask them there. Finally, this session is recorded. Loads of people last week wanted us to be able to share them with other members of their team. We'll be posting these, the recording on Twitter when it's done. Okay, so let's crack on. So the first question, which came off Twitter, is what makes a great instructional coach, but also what makes a bad coach? And we're going to go initially to Claire.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. I think first of all, whether or not you're a good coach or not depends on the conditions around coaching in a school, right? So you're going to pick up on this next time in terms of culture, but having this kind of shared language for teaching is really important to make a great coach, because if you don't have as a school a real shared language or shared understanding around what teaching and learning looks like, then it's very difficult to be a great coach in that context. So it's about creating those conditions in terms of that wider teaching and learning picture for the school. I think the other thing is to be really aware of is that just because you're a good teacher doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be a good coach. You absolutely need to be a good teacher to be a good coach, but that doesn't mean that you'll be a good coach in itself. And I think one of the things that is worth really bearing in mind is when you're looking at who your coaches might be and whether or not they're going to be good at that, is whether or not they are kind of consciously competent. I think we have in schools, we often have teachers who are maybe unconsciously competent, i.e. they are great teachers, but they probably can't really break down the reasons why they're great teachers. They might not have those same kind of mental models around, well, this is how I model and it's because of this, or this is how I explain because of this. So even if you're a great teacher, if you can't explain the process and the thought process that's going through your mind as you're teaching, you're not necessarily going to be a great coach. And I think it's also really important to see that actually, even if you're a subject leader, doesn't mean you'll necessarily be a good coach. I think there are lots of subject leaders who are really great at operational things and systematic things and strategic things, but maybe they're not as good at developing people. And if you want to be a really good coach, you also need to have a good connection with people, because when you're being coached, it's quite an exposing thing. It can make you feel quite vulnerable. And therefore, being a coach requires you to be able to build relationships with people really quickly. Now, obviously, there are tools to help you with that, which I think I'll probably talk about a little bit later on. But it doesn't always match up that someone who's a really great subject leader or someone who's a really great teacher will automatically be a good coach.
Thank you so much, Claire. Did you say, what do you think?
Yeah, what do you think? What do you think, both of you?
Well, I'd like to go to Jon first. John, you're on mute, pal.
Did it? I feel like Claire was kind of, even though we don't know each other that well, I feel like the whole thing was just like a veiled attack at me around sort of like being, because I was quite a mediocre coach, and there was quite a lot of being occupying a particular position doesn't necessarily mean you're a great coach. So most of what I'm going to draw upon is I've been coached by really good coaches at Reach, especially Tilly, our primary head teacher, just incredible. So that's sort of like where, so hopefully I can see it from both angles of like what made me like relatively mediocre and what made what made her so good. And I think that it comes down to two things, so which build neatly on what Claire was talking about. The main thing is that Tilly made you better as a teacher, and that maybe stating the obvious, she made you better as a teacher. That's important as a coach. They have to make people better, and she made you feel good about doing it. And those are like the two things. She makes people better and she makes them feel good about doing it. Now, maybe stating the obvious, but I think that there are coaches who do like one or the other or neither of those things. So I think that there are people where a coaching system is put in place and people are not getting any better. They're not actually improving their practice in the classroom, and they're sad about it because it feels like it's something that's quite horrible that's happening to them. Similarly, you can have people where they have a great time and a lovely chat, but they don't actually get any better in the classroom. They enjoy the kind of conversation, but they don't actually get any better in the classroom. Or you can have maybe some improvement, but through such incredibly sort of either very high stakes or very draconian or very authoritarian, it means that people don't really enjoy that and probably likely to move on. And so in terms of a lasting approach, it's not going to be particularly helpful. So I think that although it sounds very basic, I'll go into a little bit of the nuts and bolts perhaps in the next question, but I think that those are the two things for me. You need somebody who can make teachers better and make them feel good about doing it.
I really like that. I was thinking about like more of the soft skills when you guys were chatting. It's like, you know, as Claire said, you need to know about the nuts and bolts of teaching and learning and have a really good picture of what great teaching looks like. But I think for me, it was like remembering how absolutely bloody hard it is to learn how to teach myself. You know, it's like I didn't get good at teaching fast. Like I spent a couple of years being pretty bad at it. And for me, it was kind of that process of being like, gosh, I used to find getting better at really quite simple things pretty hard to do. Kind of helped me at, you know, when I'm working with a teacher that maybe is not currently having the best time or is struggling to make a change, you're like, right, I found this really hard to learn, you know, and that kind of gives you the kind of, I don't know what it's, a sense of like how much you have to break things down or just how easy you need to make things for other people when you're working with them.
And I think if you are going to be a good coach, you also need to have that vulnerability and humility that you can bring to that conversation. So talking, you know, being willing to talk about where you haven't done things very well or where things have gone wrong, I think is really important. It's not it shouldn't be a kind of one-way conversation where you're just telling someone what to do. There's a people first element to coaching if you want to get anywhere with that person.
So that kind of brings me to kind of the second part of that question. Like, so what if anything does it mean to like be a bad coach?
I mean, it's the opposite of what we just said, right?
Yeah, so, yeah, everything reversed.
Everything, but the other way. I think also, but again, it's like I mentioned at the beginning about creating the conditions, but also like being a bad coach is just not turning up, right? But if you're a leader, if you're a senior leader, you've got to then look at why aren't coaches turning up, or why are these conversations not happening, and where are the barriers and how do you remove them? So that sometimes you can be a bad coach not because you want to be, but because everything else gets in the way. And you know, sometimes so often, isn't it, in schools when things are really busy, it's the CPD stuff that gets put to one side. It isn't always the ring fence thing, because that's something you can catch up on later. And that's about you. It's not about, you know, the kids all in front of you in the moment, right? So I think that there is an element there where if you're looking at someone who's say a bad coach, actually, what conditions are you creating for that not to be the case? And so often it is to just do with you're not in the moment, or you're not present, or you don't turn up. If we want this as a systemic change in schools, we need to create the conditions and ring fence that time, and that can be really hard. You have to commit, right?
And I think
you want to do.
that's the most one of, I don't know about you, Claire, but I think working with schools over the last couple of years, it's probably the most common error or the most common reason for coaching as opposed to coaches being bad is that the proper time isn't dedicated towards it, and maybe somebody seems like, as you say, somebody seems like a bad coach because they haven't had the time to drop in or to like process and think about what they've done. And it's, when you're being coached by somebody and they haven't thought about it beforehand, straight away. And it's really toxic to the whole process, because if your experience of coaching is somebody coming in and flustered, sort of saying, what was it again? It was English, wasn't it? Was it Macbeth? Okay, I think you could do some cold calling. Then which is where people normally go, then you can, instructional coaching is, the risk is that it becomes an incredibly effective way of making cold calling happen in every classroom. Then it poisons the well, I think to a large extent. You're going to be way less receptive, and potentially even like the whole coaching thing across the school, people think this isn't really anything different than a new way of doing a kind of a morning briefing announcement.
I think, that, and I think also the idea that actually what the coaching is for, it can make, like, if as a coach you're going and thinking, right, I'm gonna nail this person because they're not doing X, Y, and Z. That's not what coaching's about at all. And it's not about high stakes, it's not about judgment. And if you are a coach who comes in with that mentality of this is about judging your teaching, or this is about, tripping you up because you're not doing the things you're supposed to be doing, is the single best way to completely ruin any culture that you might want to be creating around professional development in the school, is that you're using that as a mechanism for the wrong things. And I think that can be quite easy to do. I think there are absolutely people who are not very good coaches because they don't really get what that coaching is for, that it's not about judgment, it's not about proving, it's about improving that person. So I think it's that mindset when you go in, what is the purpose? If you haven't got that right, that's not going to make you a very good coach.
Thanks so much, Claire. And thanks so much, John, as well. All right, we're going to move to kind of a question which comes off what Claire just said. So is it easy to be a great coach? And coming off what Claire said earlier, like, is it enough just to, like, I'm a great teacher, I'll naturally be a great coach? What knowledge, what skills, what mindsets might you need? So is it easy to be a great coach? Can you just be a great teacher? And like, what is it that makes a great coach? What knowledge, skills, and mindsets do you need? And we'll start with John answering.
It's not easy to be a good coach. I think like with teaching, there does seem to be some people who just naturally take to it. So sometimes, I'm sure you had this experience, you're watching, an NQT or an ECT now, and they've been teaching for 5 minutes and you think, bloody hell, they're better than me. And they've been doing this for almost no time at all. It does seem like there's some people who just do take to coaching. I think but like with teaching, for the vast majority of us, it's a hard graft where we do well in some respects, but not so well in others. It requires a bunch of domain-specific knowledge, which is at the moment not particularly well defined. I think we're getting better at sort of like setting out what that is, and I'll talk about it in a moment. But all of that means is that it's really easy to, I think, for this not to go well, and for that to be for there to be an illusion of kind of great instructional coaching happening because you've assigned people as instructional coaches and maybe they were good teachers, and so off they go having their conversations. And although we're starting to get a sense of sort of what coaching might look like in schools, I don't think that yet as a profession we've thought well about how do you develop teacher educators, how do you develop sort of like coaches in a kind of, what's the induction, what's the sort of starting point, what's the ongoing professional development for those people, quite meta. In terms of what, like, the ingredients for them, like the knowledge, skills, and mindsets that you need. So let's start with knowledge. I mentioned before, expertise in any domain. Like one of the absolute core common findings is that for in any domain, what's driving expertise is large amounts of knowledge. Experts just know more about the thing that they're operating in, and that knowledge is organized differently to in novices. So it's organized in kind of like actionable mental models, which means that they can react quicker. They perceive the classroom or they perceive teaching in a different way. So when you have a great coach who knows a lot, they will literally see a different classroom to a novice, somebody that's not sort of like practiced in that. They're able to spot patterns and preempt sort of errors in ways that novices aren't able to. So what might that, people use this term domain specific knowledge a lot, and very often it's kind of like domain specific knowledge, and then people sort of like move on. So let's break it down. Well, actually, Peps did this like a few years ago when he talked about learning. He wrote a paper for, it was the Institute for Teaching then, now Ambition Institute, learning what is it and how can we catalyze it, and then another on developing great teachers. So 4 areas I think of sort of like knowledge that great coaches should have. So the first is that they should have a good understanding of sequences of learning. So sometimes called pedagogical content knowledge. Whatever lesson it is that they're watching, whether it's a year 2 grammar lesson or a year 11 science lesson, do they have a good sense of what it is that the pupils are expected to know, and the best way of kind of like breaking that down, presenting and sequencing that knowledge? You need to know that to be able to sort of like assess, analyze, coach on that lesson. And so there's a question about subject specificity, which maybe we'll get into later on. Second, often overlooked, the kids. I think that good coaches need to know the kids really well. This might be a point of disagreement amongst us. I think that they need to know the kids really well. And that's why I don't think that I could, even if I were a fantastic coach, I don't think I could come into one of your schools, Claire, and like do a really good job at coaching one of the teachers. I think you need to know the kids really well. I think that that's important. I think there's some good research on the sort of like, well, we kind of intuitively know this anyway, right? Because when we cover a lesson, we're all of a sudden like an order of magnitude worse teacher. You can go from giving like an amazing year 10 English lesson and then cover a year 8 class that you don't normally teach, even if it's potentially in English, and all of a sudden like you don't know the kids and you're a lot worse as a teacher, because knowing the kids matters. Matters culturally, it matters behaviorally, but it also matters in terms of one of the most important pieces of information about learning is kids' prior knowledge. And if you don't know those kids really well, then you don't have that key piece of knowledge. So I think that those are 2 things. So sort of pedagogical content knowledge of kids, the kids. I think that an understanding of learning more generally, so something like the science of learning, which I think feeds into what Claire was talking about, of that kind of shared language around teaching and learning. So something around cognitive load theory, something around sort of germane loading and gradually sort of like fading guidance and that kind of instructional process. I think that that's crucial. Something of like the standard model of teaching and learning, whether you're coaching in a nursery classroom or in a A-level classroom, it's going to be really relevant because it's the kids' minds. And then the last thing is sort of like something around self-regulation and understanding yourself really well, your own biases, your own prejudices, your own kind of like pet hates, your own kind of sort of like tics. Because coaching isn't about making mini me's, right? It's not about sort of like, I'm your coach, so you're going to be a tiny little me. There's an apprenticeship element to it, but it's about allowing them to become the best version of themselves as a teacher. And so there's a certain level of depersonalization that has to take place, which means having a strong understanding of yourself and your own regulation. So I think that that's kind of the knowledge that I'd be wanting to work on with coaches. Like, do you know the kids really well? Do you have a good, strong understanding of science of learning? Have you got good pedagogical content knowledge around the subject areas that you'll be coaching in? And do you understand yourself really well? So that's the kind of knowledge. In terms of sort of like the mindsets I want to turn to next. So I think that great coaches are inquisitive. I think yes, there's emotional intelligence and there's humility, which Claire's already talked about, but I think that great coaches are inquisitive, and they go into classrooms, and Claire already spoke about this, with a genuine curiosity of I'm looking at, I'm not looking for. Because where coaching can go wrong is where it just becomes a kind of a preordained delivery mechanism for teach like a champion, or whatever sort of like rubric you've sort of selected. It's going to be one of the things on this list. I'm looking for which one's missing so I can tick that one off. Whereas I think that great coaches are inquisitive, and what they're starting with is kind of what a colleague of mine, Ambition, Steve Farn, calls the problem of learning. Like what here is the kind of the problem that needs to be solved around why learning isn't as good as it possibly could be, because it can always be better. And that then leads you to the area. So it's not, okay, I've got this list of like behavioral techniques that we're trying to roll out across the school. So let's look to see if they're doing threshold. If they're not, it's that. Let's look to see if they're doing kind of like pens in the air. If they're not, then it's that. It's kind of a distraction. It doesn't necessarily matter if they're putting their pens in the air or not, even if it's on the policy. Maybe it's a separate conversation of like, adhere to the policy, but it's not a coaching conversation. The coaching conversation should start with something like, the kids didn't understand the concept after you taught it. Like, that was clear. They were confused. You set them off on their independent task and loads of them didn't know what to do. Why was that? And a genuine, like, a no sort of, why was that? I'm inquisitive of why was that? And it might be that the explanation was poor. It might be that the teacher sort of like gave 150 different sort of concepts at once and overloaded the kids. But it might not be. It might be that the kids were all like chatting and walking around the room because the behavior was terrible. Or it might be that the explanation was really good and the behavior is really good, but maybe it just so happens that because of prior knowledge of the pupils, that procedure was just too long, even though it was well broken down and explained, and so they needed to shorten the kind of instructional process and practice before moving. So great coaches won't go in with those preconceptions. They'll be really genuinely inquisitive. So I think that those like the two like things for me you need to develop, and obviously both of those things are really tough. Like partially. So I mentioned before, expertise, domain-specific knowledge is really key. Like lots of research from Erickson and David Berliner sort of like pulls that out. But Berliner, the kind of like the mastermind on teacher expertise, is also really clear that experience is necessary. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary. And I think there's a similar thing with coaching. I think experience, like going into lots of classrooms and with that inquisitive mindset, matters. I'll pause there because I'm sure I've missed loads.
Thanks so much, John. Claire, what do you think of John's definition of what it means to be a great coach in terms of knowledge and mindset? Did he miss anything?
I shouldn't think so. I think that it's this thing of when you're having that conversation with somebody, and you talked about questions and drawing out questions, it's also being able to help someone else create mental models around what that might look like in a different context, or what that might look like, because you're not going to be there in every lesson, right? So when you're taking them through that process, if you're just saying, do this, you're not creating a mental model for the future. So I think what John's picked out there around being inquisitive and asking questions isn't just about the relationship you're creating. It's also about trying to put someone in a position that they will answer those questions themselves. So for example, if I was saying to someone, talk to you about how many pupils in that lesson do you think were thinking hard, and how do you know? That becomes a question that they can then ask themselves over and over again when they're teaching, rather than me just saying, well, do you think that when you were modelling just then, everyone else should have been, annotating at the same time and you could have done some questioning at the same time? So rather than me saying, do this, you're saying, when you're asking that question around what do you think of, or how can you nudge pupils in this direction, it's the type of question that allows them to ask themselves that later that I think is vital. Because otherwise I always think of coaching as being almost cumulative. So like you might give someone one action step, but that whole conversation around that action step is supposed to trigger ideas around where they could use that elsewhere, or where they could shift their practice elsewhere, not just in that one thing. And a really great coach will be able to ask the right questions to do that. That's a really tough skill, and you need to give coaches the tools to do that. But that is the difference, I think, between okay coaching and great coaching, because it allows, in the same way as, not just giving kids the answers all the time, because then you're not going to be with them in an exam. It's that kind of thought process for a coach.
Yeah, like we're trying to build expert teachers, and so we're not just giving people like techniques they can use once off. We're trying to make them be able to apply technique flexibly and when they think it's best to do so.
Yeah, and if you ask the right questions, it helps them to look for when that's not happening themselves.
There's I'm mostly a primary teacher. I was a primary trainer, spent most of my time primary, but at Reach we're in all three, so I was able to teach an A level in religious studies. And there's a philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, who is kind of like the father of utilitarianism, and along with J.S. Mill, they developed this what is called the hedonic calculus, because the kind of the key measure of utilitarianism is the greatest like happiness for the greatest number. But how do you calculate that? And they have this like series of like measures, and I think that there's some bear with me, I think there's like some parallels with coaching, because they talk about like, well, what makes something a greater pleasure or greater happiness? And they talk about like the scale, like the large number of people that are happy, like it goes up on that kind of calculus, but also the intensity of the happiness or the pleasure kind of like matters. And there's one which one measure, which is it's a fun word to say, it's the fecundity, which is kind of like the fertility, how likely it is to breed other goods. So if a pleasure is more likely to cause, then like have a knock-on effect and cause more pleasure, then it rates highly on the scale. And I like that from like a coaching perspective, like, because I think Claire's right. You can give people some kind of tools and lenses and ways of thinking that mean that it's not just them doing that one thing in that lesson that's going to change. It's kind of going to then have a knock-on effect on all sorts of areas of their practice.
Really nice. So, all right. So that leads us to the next question. So it's tough to be a great coach, and like actually it's kind of easy to be a coach who's just like focusing on what's missing or what technique do I think this teacher needs to apply, and we need to help coaches to kind of move beyond that. So how can we do that? How can we best train coaches? Should we just go around and choose people we think are likely to be good at coaching, or should we choose widely and then put a great training program in place, and if so, what would it look like? So I'm going to go to Claire first. How can we select or train our coaches?
So I think it's probably useful for me to start with my context, which is that I mostly look after two large primaries with 180 in each year group. As such, you're going to have a high number of teachers, and therefore you need a high number of coaches. Mm-hmm. You know, we're talking about trying to help improve the teaching of well over maybe 100 plus teachers. I don't know, you have to look at my Steplab data to tell me how many I've got on there. And so that matching up it can be really challenging, because you're trying to think about it's almost like I feel like I could probably go into some kind of dating agency next. Like I could probably do that as a job. Like, who do I match up with whom based on what their likes and dislikes are, right? Mm-hmm. So it's about kind of choosing those coaches that have got the right skills. John's talked about all the different skills that you would need, but also then thinking about how those skills match with who's best to go with. So for example, most of the time I try to keep within subject, because subject knowledge is vital. I'm not a fan of generic kind of pedagogy. It's all about what does this look like in X subject. So for me, as an English specialist going in and being a coach for a mathematician, I will only be able to take them so far. In some ways it might be quite useful, because if I understand it, you're probably doing okay. But for the most part, it's going to be someone who is the same specialism as them, or within, I might pair up someone who's got history and English background. They might pair up in that way. That's fine. And so I think there is something with the subject knowledge side of things, but also what that teacher needs. So if I have somebody who is working on classroom management, maybe de-escalation, or about positive, all the different things that you might do in a classroom, building relationships, etc. I might pair them up with a coach who's really great at that domain specific thing. So there are so many different aspects that I'm looking at when I'm pairing up, because I have so many people to pair up, and therefore in some ways that's great, because I have lots of options, and then in other ways it's quite challenging. What we have done is we've we've got lead practitioners now in many, we have invested in that. So we have lead practitioners who spend a huge amount of their time coaching maths, science. We've got one maths, science, English, humanities, etc. And they spend a lot of their time honing their coaching skills. And they've done a lot of training on how to be a good coach. Some of that training is stuff that we have made. So we've made videos where we filmed a coaching session to kind of model that. We also do a lot of paired coaching or shadowing, those kinds of things to make sure that coaching is really effective. So really investing in the coaches and investing in the time they've got to do that, because we know now that this is transformative in terms of teaching and learning. We know that because we have seen the difference it has made in the couple of years that we've been doing this, and how the whole school in terms of quality of education has shifted because of it. And so we've really invested in that and the training in that. And I think also providing tools to the coach to help with those conversations, those more personal conversations around, how do you get asked the right questions? Well, maybe you talk about a scale. So you say, okay, well, if great questioning in your classroom at a 10, what does that look like? Let's talk about that. What would be happening? What would the students be doing? What would you be doing? What's happening in that room? That's a 10. Okay, so this is what we saw in the lesson. How far away are we from that 10 and why? Okay, so what do we need to do? And providing those kinds of tools to the coach to have those conversations, that it's not just, whilst obviously Steplab breaks everything down, actually there are additional tools that we've given coaches to help with those conversations, to kind of take those a step further, including kind of the ratio thing. There's how many pupils are thinking hard, how many pupils are thinking. That's a really powerful tool to start those conversations. And again, as a coach, saying, well, why don't you try? And what I sometimes have is coaches kind of saying to me, look, I've got someone, I'm not quite sure how to approach this, and we'll do some coaching around how to coach them. It's having those mechanisms in place for the coach in order to support them. And I think that part of the reason that works and that coaching model is working is because of the lack of judgment, and because our kind of performance appraisal side of things has no connection to anything other than developing as a teacher. And therefore you buy into those coaching conversations, because that's the only thing that you've got to do across the year is get better at the thing or things that you've identified you'd like to get better at. And so because we've created those conditions for the coach to have those meaningful conversations, there's that two-way process of the coach is fully trained and fully prepared, but so is the teacher to invest in this, to buy into this, because it's been set up to do so. And I think that you have to have the two things. Otherwise, it doesn't really matter how great your coach is. It's not going to kind of work. And then at the same time, with all of this, with all that matching, with all of that training, with all those different elements, it has to be a conversation, right? So I'm not sitting there with a spreadsheet matching people up. I'm having conversations, or I'm asking my lead practitioners to have conversations, or I'm asking my directors of learning or my subject leaders, whoever, to have conversations to look at who to match and who feels comfortable, and saying to people, come to me if this isn't working. Have a conversation with me if this isn't working. Because just because someone said that this might be a good match, or someone thinks that these two skill bases, when you match them together, will be useful, doesn't necessarily mean that will definitely work. And so before I even kind of start putting, adding people and saying, these are the pairings, these are the triads, you've got to have several different conversations, because otherwise you're not going to get that buy-in for the match. And if the match isn't right, it's not going to work.
Thanks so much, Claire. A really careful kind of approach to matching up who might work with who, which I think is fascinating. John, before we move on, your take on training of coaches, any response to what Claire said?
Yeah, so I think that there are pros and cons to. I don't think there's a right or a wrong approach here. I think there are pros and cons to both. So roughly speaking, I sometimes characterize this as like what I call like comrade coaching, which is where basically everybody's a coach and everybody's coached. So you can essentially activate every teacher as a coach. And I think this is similar to a kind of approach that you took at Oasis South Bank. And I think that there are kind of like some of the benefits of that are that it creates, first of all, it's logistically perhaps more straightforward because you can ring fence kind of like a time that everybody is going to do the kind of like the coaching session together, and you could potentially do that publicly, which creates a really great culture. I think that there are some like drawbacks in that you're going to get like a variability in kind of the quality of those conversations because you've got a larger group. So like the other approaches, and again, like the other extreme, I guess, is what I sometimes call commando coaching, which is where you kind of just choose like your 2 or 3 absolute best teachers, communicators, teacher educators. And the advantage of this is, that every coaching conversation is going to be really good quality. The disadvantage is that it means that it consumes like most of their timetable. Even if you give them like 10 teachers, that's probably like basically their job now. And if that person also happened to like look after the data in your school or something like that, like they may be less able to do that. So I think that there are pros and cons kind of to either approach, and largely it's probably actually going to be determined more by your school resources and constraints around like contextual factors with school. Whether teachers in some schools, teachers like watch the 1265 hours like in a central spreadsheet like a hawk, and others like there's more discretionary effort from folks. That's going to factor into it. How many ECTs you have, how many more experienced teachers you have, I think it's all going to like factor into you making a kind of a best judgment. Then around training, so I think Claire's right, video is just invaluable here, and I think that there are like 3 things that can be helpful in training coaches. The first is identifying that core knowledge that we talked about. That's kind of like domain knowledge. So for us, it would be those 4 areas and making sure they have that. And it's going to take time to develop each of those, but say like these are the 4 buckets of like knowledge you need to know, learn that. The second thing is just spending time. This is like, we did this quite a lot at Reach, get all of the coaches in a room, get them to watch a bit of video together and get them to discuss what action step they'd select and why. There will be some variation, and it doesn't matter what the action step is. What's more instructive is the conversations of sort of why you focused on the areas that you focused. And it does allow you to if you are leading coaching in your school, it does allow you, if there is like some real sort of like wild card in there that's maybe way off sort of what you think around sort of like, yeah. And then the last part is, so Tilly led coaching in the primary when I was at Reach up until about a year ago as a teacher and assistant head, and she would ask us just to film a coaching session every now and then and give us feedback on our coaching. So it was a bit giggly to begin with, but we set up just an iPad and I'd have a coaching conversation as I normally would with one of my teachers, and then Tilly would watch them through, spot any key core themes, potentially plan training for coaches on the back of that, which area is potentially less strong across the different coaches, but also give you some individual feedback around during the probing questions. It was very waffly, they were very vague, you were doing a bit of guess what's in my head. And you can have coaching on coaching, which works out quite nicely.
Thanks so much, John. Thank you, Claire. We're gonna do the final question, but we're gonna try and do it in 6 minutes. So we've got 15 to do questions at the end. So the recent EEF study about effective PD suggests that like if it makes teachers change, then it has certain mechanisms or kind of like important components, some of which are kind of rehearsal or deliberate practice with feedback, some kind of clear modeling, etc., etc. So my question is like, why should, and it seems like these are important parts of coaching. That's why the form of instructional coaching kind of is, people hold it up as it is something that can work. It kind of contains these mechanisms quite commonly. But other people think like, well, why should I practice outside the classroom? It's not realistic. It can't work. How can I model effectively without pupils present? Or I find these things incredibly uncomfortable. I don't want to do coaching because I don't like to do these things. So my question is, I guess, what's your thoughts about that? And we'll do 3 minutes from John and 3 minutes from Claire if possible. Go on, John.
I'll be quite punchy here to begin with, and then soften it. So yes, it's uncomfortable rehearsing. Nobody really likes it. Very few people. Massive, like I liked it. Like real narcissists like it, and I loved rehearsal and practice. But most people don't. Most people find it uncomfortable. And we kind of had a mantra of like just lean it, like rehearsal is uncomfortable, do it anyway. And sort of giving people permission of like, yes, it is uncomfortable. If you're a coach, go first. Like that is just like the number one tip. Go first. If you're a coach, say, we think this is the action step. Shall I have a go first? And mess it up. Like that creates, don't deliberately do it, but if you mess it up, even better, because it allows you to model, oh crap, like that's not how I'm going to do it again. Vulnerable. To show like that, wow. Yeah, and also, isn't it lucky that we're practicing this, because it's really hard to do first time. That's the kind of reason we're doing it. So I think that rehearsal is important for 3 reasons. I think so. Belinda, who I talked about earlier, talks about like core skills and higher order skills in teaching specifically. And he talks about how one of the features of expert teachers is that they've just automated core skills. Higher order skills you probably can't automate because they're so context specific. They vary based on like conditions. But he argues there's a bunch of like teaching which is fairly core, and we know this when we've been teaching for a while, because we can like shush a classroom quite quickly, whereas like newer teachers like just can't do that. And so you automate these kind of like core things, and you free up, like in the sort of like lingo of the science of learning, you essentially free up working memory capacity, because you're not now thinking about how do I get the children to all be quiet. You can think about other stuff like which kids look like they haven't understood this. And so that's part of it. It allows you to automate those key skills. The second part is very often I would have a coaching conversation. We'd agree the action step. They might have even said it. And then we'd say, great, let's rehearse it. And as soon as they start rehearsing, they go, this action step is wrong, or I need to change this action step, because it's only through going through the process of realizing actually it needs to be contextualized, it needs to be tweaked, it needs to be refined, it needs to be broken down a little bit further. I can't order this in one go. And so it basically stress tests the action step, and you're better stress testing it in the coaching conversation before you've left than getting to the classroom and then realizing the action step wasn't quite right, and going back to the coaching conversation saying, actually I didn't do that because it didn't really work. So those would be the reasons I would say that you do rehearsal or you do deliberate practice.
I think actually also picking up from what you said about stress testing as well, making sure that there actually isn't a gap between what the coach thinks this should look like and what the coachee thinks this should look like, right? So once you get through that rehearsal stage, that deliberate practice stage, actually, are you actually talking about the same thing? Because that can sometimes be quite difficult, particularly if someone's a real novice and they don't really, like, maybe we don't really understand the terminology that's being used in quite the same way as the coach does, and therefore doesn't really get what that looks like in practice. And I think it comes back to, if you want to do these things, it comes back to that careful matching. It comes back to the relationships that you've built, and also stressing that there's this positive framing around that deliberate practice, which is around their confidence, and that actually it's really fine to get things wrong. And John said about the coach kind of maybe getting things wrong. Sometimes I think it's really useful to do it on purpose to get those things wrong and kind of go, well, what's wrong with what what is going to be a problem here if I do it like this, or what's the kind of difference between me doing it like this and doing it like this, and almost acting that model out as part of the decision-making process, actually, because rather than getting to the point of having the action step and practicing that action step, actually I think there's opportunities beforehand to kind of go, well, say I stood up and I did X, Y, and Z, what do you think of? And that again helps to create those kind of mental models around what to do next time. There's lots of stages, I think, where you can have those conversations. And I think that when you've got really good coaches, or you've got a culture of coaching, it just becomes really normalized. And this is something that I really recognize when I had a conversation with someone just this afternoon in a different school who wanted to talk about how we do coaching on the kind of scale that we do where we are. in the context that we have. And I kind of said to him, like, it's everything else goes around it first, so that when you get into that room, it's not kind of saying we're doing this strange thing. It's kind of there's so much that feeds into it being in the heart of what we do that it doesn't really mean very much anymore. But it was a really good reminder to me as well where different schools are on that journey to getting there, where we were having conversations about, you know, we have teachers who they don't want you to go into their classroom ever, and the door is very much closed. So I think it's recognizing if you are, you know, leading on these kinds of things in a school or in a trust, recognizing where the school is before you start, because these barriers that we're talking about right now about, oh, you know, people might feel a bit, you know, not very confident about doing the rehearsal side. That's quite far on in the journey from having people even wanting you in the classroom in the first place, because there's a lot of PTSD still out there around high stakes accountability and observation. That means that before you can even get through the door to have a conversation about teaching and learning, or before you can even think about coaching, I have worked with schools where I said, what's your kind of teaching learning policy? Like, how do you, there isn't one.
Yeah.
There's lots and lots of steps before you even get there. And it was a real reflection of mine that actually there are some schools like Reach, like ours, that are really, really far ahead in this journey. And then we're talking about the idealism, we're talking about the tweaks. And then there are kind of schools who are just dipping their toe in the water, and there's a lot to undo first.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, like, I sometimes speak to leaders of coaching, and they're like, oh, you know, my coaches aren't doing it every week, or people aren't, the modeling needs to be better. And you're like, look, where were you 3 years ago? You know, no one saw anyone's lesson. People got seen 3 times a year. And now you've got like 30 coaches in your school who are observing teachers regularly and, you know, giving great feedback. Like, it might not be perfect, but it's a damn sight better than, you know, like what there was in the past. And that means a lot. I'm going to dip into some questions for the last 12 or 13 minutes. And we've got 2 great questions from Jane Price. By the way, now will be the time to ping your questions if you want them to be answered by our panel. Start getting them in the Q&A. So Jane says, she's got 2 questions. How important is it for staff to have a wider understanding of coaching in order to be coached effectively? And then the second was, are there expectations of the coachee as well as of the coach?
Should I do one and you do 2, John? You got that? So I think the most important thing is to start with why. So if you're going to introduce anything in a school and you don't want it to lethally mutate into something else, you start with why and then how, and not just the what. So saying to people, we're going to do instructional coaching and this is what it looks like, without a really clear, this is why we're doing instructional coaching, this is the background behind it, this is some of the research behind why we've chosen it, this is why it's transformative, this is why fidelity to the process is so important. The how is then going to go wrong if you don't have those things. So I do think it's really vital that those who are engaging in this really understand why, in order to have that fidelity, because it can be very easy for it to become this is just something that we do and we have a chat about teaching and I fill in this form online and then I press send and you work on this thing. And I think that's the case for anything you introduce in the school. There's that 3-step process: why, how, is, and then, you know, what overall. But so often we just start with what. That's question 1. What do you want to add to that?
So expectations of coachees are doing another annoying it depends, because it depends. Like, you have to start with where people are. You have to start with where people are. You can say everybody should be committed to this because it's going to benefit kids and themselves. You can believe that. But as Claire says, if somebody's spent, you know, this is where, again, like, you need to show a little bit of humility and show a little bit of sort of understanding of, you could have somebody who's been teaching for 30 years and they have had not positive experiences of people coming into their classrooms and then coming and talking to them about their teaching. This may well be just fad number 175 for them. They may be cynical, they may be jaded. That may be well placed, because we know that there have been lots of silly sort of like fads. How do we know that this isn't this year's flavor? So you have to meet where people are. I think that one thing that schools can do now is that they should start recruiting for capacity to develop and sort of like keenness to develop. It's something that Reach did from the start, from the school opening. So when I joined Reach, I taught the same lesson twice with a coaching conversation in between. And in the interview, Ed and Rebecca were very clear with me of, we don't care how good a teacher you are now, we care about whether you respond to feedback and whether you're willing to do that. And that's who they're the only people that are gonna work here. No superhero teachers, no rock star teachers. It's all about capacity to improve and willingness to do so. You can start doing that now. For some schools are in different places, but you can start doing that now. And then you can gradually increase the expectation around like turn up, meet your action steps, blah, blah, blah. I would be hesitant. I would caution hesitancy around having like big non-negotiables with teachers around kind of like coaching and stuff like that. In fact, and again, you may disagree here, when people say what happens if a teacher is like absolutely resolutely against coaching in a school, my advice would be allow them to opt out. Allow them to opt out, make a big fuss of everybody else that's doing it, gradually build that critical mass, make them feel like the odd one out, make it clear that culturally they're the odd one out. Start to narrate that everybody, almost everybody in this school is absolutely committed to improving. That would be my advice.
So we've got some related questions. One from Duncan, who I think has joined us all the way from New Zealand. Welcome, Duncan. And a similar one from Lisa. So Duncan says thoughts on how to get started with people who are initially resistant to coaching. And Lisa's is, so maybe in a school without a real kind of culture of doors being open and visits to lessons, is with those kind of getting your foot through the door conversations, how would you preempt a situation that could almost be described as sabotage, where something in the early stages of a coaching relationship goes a bit wrong and the person flings their arms up in the air and says something like, oh, I told you that wouldn't work. Coaching's a fad, or this isn't going to work for me. So it's like resistance, and then the next level, which is kind of like slight sabotage. Like, what can you do? How can you deal with that when you confront it? And it kind of relates to what John said, which is like some, maybe letting people opt out at first and building the culture. But anyway, over to you guys. Should we start with Claire?
Yeah, I think with anything that you introduce, trying to start with your bright spots that are going to do all the bits and be really positive, and actually almost finding those people who are quite influential in the school, maybe the people who sometimes are less, a bit more cynical and less likely to kind of really buy into things, and kind of getting them on side first, or having those bright spots where they talk up their journey. So one of the things that we did when we introduced it, and it kind of happened just naturally, is that people who were getting coached were so positive about it and so chuffed about how they were doing that they just talked about it to people all the time. And they were really good kind of, this person's done this and it's worked so beautifully. Why don't you go speak to them? Why don't you go see them? Why don't you, have that conversation? So those kind of bright spots where you really encourage that positive message around what they're doing to improve, because there will be those positive messages, because it does improve teaching. We know this. I think the other thing is again, creating that open door culture. One of the things that we found is that whilst coaching itself, the instructional coaching side of what we do is really powerful, what's been just as powerful is what we call kind of the drop-in function, where, to give you a really really nice example. Since September, I had checked this morning. Since September, in one of our schools, there's been nearly 500 drop-ins. In fact, in both of our secondaries, there have been nearly 500 drop-ins. And these are completely non-hierarchical, people popping into each other's lessons, saying lovely things about each other, asking curious questions, giving them shout-outs, and creating this whole conversation around teaching that simply wasn't there before. And therefore, what has then happened is that people who have got kind of drop-ins but haven't engaged in coaching so much are then kind of saying, well, I want coaching, I want more. I really, really liked that process. Or they are more actively seeking out opportunities to go and see other people. And by the very nature of that two-way conversation that's happening, people are using the skills that they've got from coaching others to have really meaningful teaching and learning conversations. But then that is continuing that kind of snowball effect of people wanting to engage with coaching because it makes them feel good. And it's really nice to have a shout out, and it's really nice to get tips and hints on how you could get better as a teacher, because no one really wants to do a bad job. So rather than going to, for a couple of people, we haven't gone down that kind of more formal coaching, full conversation route. We've gone down okay, we'll have lots of feedback and drop-ins, and actually you can add an action step when you do a drop-in anyway. They're kind of still getting some really effective input, but, in a way that's kind of bringing them along a bit more.
What do you think, John?
A bit less purist.
I agree.
Right, yeah.
I agree, and we mustn't confuse proximal and ultimate goals, right? And I think you put it nicely, Josh, when you said well, in fact, I think you're quoting Obama. Apparently, Barack Obama wanted to get this bill through, and it was the bill was getting diluted by Congress of what they wanted, and his team were furious, and his response was better is good. And him taking that kind of real change happens incrementally, and that's kind of the whole thing of coaching. Change happens incrementally. It doesn't need to be a big Hail Mary, which leads to this idea of how do you how do you avoid it being a big disaster by sort of going and don't launch it with everybody all at once if you're not 100% sure. Pilot it and scale it up from there. And it seems to be a really common kind of error. Obviously pilot it. Begin, like Claire says, and begin with strong teachers, respected teachers, and make a fuss about that. It is a worry of mine. I had a school who contacted me last year actually, and they said they wanted me to do some coaching training with them, and I said I couldn't do it. And they said, "Oh, that's a shame." I think it was in May last year, and they said that's a shame because we're launching coaching, instructional coaching across our secondary school with every teacher in September. And I said, "Well, hold on a second, you don't know what it is." But that was the plan. Then we decided, so we need to get somebody into some training quickly. So we decided that's now going to be the thing.
I can see that will happen. I can see, you can see what that, the school improvement, there's that rapidity that's required and but yeah, it's not going to achieve anything. And similarly, that kind of phrase you said, is don't let perfect get in the way of good. If you're going to implement something, it doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be the ideal. I have, one of my schools is a free school, the other was an established, been around for a long time school. It is easier to establish in a free school. And looking at models like some of the models out there who do instructional coaching really well, they started from scratch, Reach started from scratch. There is a slight difference in how you can launch these things.
Mm-hmm.
When you have a new free school and you have an established school with all of the context and all of the baggage that might be with that school, there's a huge difference between how you can implement those things. Sorry, I interrupted you, John.
No, well, I think actually we're priding ourselves on not going over. The time is 8:30. It's very late. And it's relaxing time for everyone. So I would like to say a massive thank you to Claire and John for giving up their evening and talking to you guys. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Next week, we are speaking to Jenny Thompson, who's the exec principal at Dixon's, Peps and I, and other special guests will be talking about implementing coaching in a coaching culture. Thanks everyone for being here, and looking forward to seeing you next week or again at some point in the future. Have a lovely evening, everyone. Bye now.